Let's see now. Let's just talk a little bit about the basics. When we make the diagnosis of child sexual abuse, a change in behavior is the most common basic thing that we see in child sexual abuse. It's a hallmark. So if you have a youth that's been at a youth serving organization event and after they return home, they start demonstrating a marked change in their behavior, this would really require some careful thinking, because one of your concerns would be what happens if a child is sexually assaulted while they're at a camp and they don't make a disclosure while they're at a camp, but they go home and then they have a big change in their behavior. That would be the first marker, is going to be a change in behavior. The research has shown that sexual offenders are highly recidivistic. So if you have a person who works in a youth serving organization, it's unlikely they're only going to offend against one child. Now, they may not offend against many children at one time, but they will usually offend against children on and on over a period of time, because as long as they have success and no one stops them, they'll just continue to do that. The information regarding the nature of a child's behavior is really important. For example, you want to know about how they're interacting with their peers, what their sleep patterns are in the camping environment. Do they have a lot of anxiety or especially phobias that would make you very concerned, fearful of going into a bathroom, for example. Kids will have separation anxiety when they go away to camp. We expect that. But if you have a child who's in camp and who has a change in their behavior while they're in camp, Monday and Tuesday they're fine, all of a sudden Wednesday they don't want to go to the bathroom anymore, they're afraid of the bathroom, they seem to be very anxious, they're crying a lot, a sudden change in behavior should cause camp counselors to be concerned that something has happened to them while they're there in camp, because usually that kind of change in behavior midway the camping experience should have a cause, and it really begs for us to look for that. Always look for genital-focused bullying behaviors, because that's one of the behaviors that's described in the literature of youth offenders or youth males who have been sexually abused. Sometimes when a boy has been sexually abused and they get into a different environment away from the offender, they may demonstrate a lot of anger and acting out behavior. The type of acting out behavior that the literature speaks of is genital-focused bullying behaviors, making fun of another child's genitals, talking about how they're just a little wimp, you know, if they're showering together or something of that nature. Really being focused a lot on the child's genitals is a marker, something to be paid attention to in that setting. Bedwetting is not unusual. If you're in camp and it's cold, you're likely to wet the bed. If you're just in any kind of strange bed, you're going to have some problems sometimes with bedwetting. That's not an unusual abnormality. But clingy behaviors that weren't present at the time when the child first arrived at camp are worrisome. And if a child returns home from a camping experience and they're very clingy to the parent and they don't want to leave them and they're crying a lot and they're acting traumatized, those are the kinds of behaviors that we would want. It'll be after the fact for you all because you won't know about that, but those are the kinds of behaviors that a child who's been sexually abused will often demonstrate. We want kids to be able to come home feeling that everything has been a good experience for them and excited. If a child leaves and goes away to camp happy and they come back from camp upset and sad, then we just have to be a little worried about that. Now, there are some sexualized behaviors that children can have that are not from sexual abuse. And Dr. William Friedrich from the Mayo Clinic gave us this sort of small laundry list about sexualized behaviors. And the term sexualized behaviors in the literature typically refers to masturbatory behaviors. Lots of children and adults do this often, very often. It usually is a behavior seeking to decrease their level of anxiety. Dr. Friedrich said that for those children who have those kinds of behaviors, who haven't been sexually abused, these are the things that it's associated with. A length of time in daycare. If a child's in daycare for more than 12 hours a day, they will have a higher incidence of masturbatory behaviors. If they live in a home where there's a lot of family violence, the child is very stressed, or stressful like circumstances like being homeless or being too transitory with respect to moving numerous times, or if you have a family that has nudity habits, co-sleeping, co-bathing, or if there's pornography exposure for the child in the home, you can see a child beginning to have sexualized behaviors. But there's a difference between sexualized behaviors, typically masturbatory behaviors, versus sexually explicit behaviors. Those are two different things. Sexually explicit behavior is when a child approaches another child or an adult in a very sexualized manner. For example, if you have a 4-year-old who walks up to a parent, a male parent, and tries to unzip the male parent's pants. That would be considered a sexually explicit behavior. That's different from a sexualized behavior. So talking to, you probably have some kind of questionnaire. I assume that you have some kind of questionnaire that parents have to fill out before their children ever come to camp. I would assume it's related to, do they have asthma, do they take medicine, some kind of screening questionnaire. I don't know if your form has something that has to do with behaviors. I think that's kind of something that you ought to consider having there. You're probably really asking about ADHD kinds of behaviors, impulsivity, or do we have to watch this child more closely? Are they a risk taker, et cetera? But behaviors should be a pretty open, free writing place on your screening, unless as compared to checking of boxes, just so that we have a better idea about how those behaviors are. The physical examination that's done for children is the least important but the most sought after component of a child sexual abuse evaluation. Everybody rushes the child to the emergency room, child makes a disclosure, let's take him to the emergency room, hurry up and get a checkup, see what has happened. In more than 93% of cases, even children who have been vaginally or anally penetrated will have a normal physical examination. This is a counterintuitive fact that has taken a lot of people in court systems a long time to recognize. And the reason that these exams are so often normal is because children, as I told you before, do not disclose right away. And often they will have healed by the time they make any kind of disclosure about what has happened to them. The likelihood of our finding some positive physical finding is going to be if we see the child within 72 hours of the last sexual contact. That's the time when we will most likely find any kind of positive physical findings. So child sexual abuse in a youth-serving personnel offender, however, is more likely to yield forensic evidence. If you have a person who works in a youth-serving organization and who is sexually offending against a child at a camping trip, it is more likely that we will find forensic evidence of that. But it'll be forensic evidence, such as DNA evidence in the cabin they were in before the cabin gets cleaned. I don't even know how the cleaning process is for the cabins from groups of children to the next group of children. But we are more likely to find forensic evidence if the child discloses shortly after an assault has occurred. And that evidence is most likely going to be DNA. And if child sexual abuse is penetrating in nature, the physical exams within 72 hours might show us redness. The only time you're going to see tears is if the child actually makes a disclosure of bleeding. If they see blood in their underwear, if they're going to the bathroom and they wipe and they see blood on the toilet tissue, we are more likely to see positive physical findings because tears don't heal up that quickly. So it was Dr. Joyce Adams who wrote the article, It's Normal to be Normal. It's sort of a gold standard for those of us who work in child sexual abuse, and that is, she examined nearly 200 children, boys and girls, for whom the confirmation of child sexual abuse was not the child's disclosure, but confession by the offenders. That's how the confirmation was. So that's probably your exact gold standard. And what she found was that in 99% of boys who had been anally penetrated, the examination was completely normal. When I explain that in courts of law, it is to help them understand that if something is going into the anus that's the same size sometimes as what's coming out or what can come out of an anus, such as a bowel movement, and doesn't tear a child, then it's likely it's not going to tear a child otherwise. So therefore, when we see children who have even been anally or vaginally penetrated, we often don't find any physical evidence. So what really establishes the diagnosis is the history that the child has told to us and the behaviors. So there's some obstacles to prevention that are very prevalent. One of them is the fact that you remember this article. Maybe you don't remember this article, but I remember this article when it came out in Sports Illustrated. And it was an article about all of these different coaches who had been convicted for sexually offending against kids on their teams. And there were all different kinds of teams where these coaches were working, but it was a wake-up call, and this is an old article. I remember this special report when it came out because it really talked about the multi-victim nature of sexual offending when you have them in sports settings. Usually these offenders do not offend against just one child. They offend against many children, and eventually they get caught. So denial of the existence of child sexual abuse and its frequency can be a problem for any youth serving organization, and a belief that screening the child participants has already prevented the presence of any victims in a group is another misconception. The screening is usually not really screening for child sexual abuse. The screening is, does your child have any communicable diseases, et cetera, et cetera. Parents often don't know that their child has been sexually abused. And there is no stereotype victim. All kinds of kids can be victims in this situation. The presence of parent volunteers, the fact that they may hinder a belief in a child's disclosure is very clear, because a parent may be the offender when a child makes a disclosure, or because the parent volunteers haven't been trained to really listen to children. So if you have parent volunteers who are your chaperones and the child is trying to make a disclosure to them because they see them as a trusted adult, they may blow the child off and say, oh, no, that's not true, that didn't really happen to you, you're confused. There's also a misconception of the stereotype of an offender. Most people think it's a stranger. Most people think it looks like a DOM, dirty old man. That's usually how that is. But oh gosh, ask me how many youth pastors are sex offenders. You can really have people who are just wonderfully nice, kind, wouldn't hurt a flea kind of person who is, in fact, a sex offender.
Details emerged today of a crime we hadn't heard about before. Nancy Garrido sat in the back of a van in 1993, luring a 5-year-old child into the van while she recorded a sexually suggestive videotape for her husband. The district attorney released that bit of news to counter any criticism that he lacks compassion. Nancy Garrido's attorney, Stephen Tapson, started the debate over compassion in the DA's office a little over 2 weeks ago. Nancy, he said, had confessed and would plead guilty if the DA would show just a little compassion.
Unfortunately, the quality of mercy is strained in El Dorado County, so as of the moment, the current offer is 241 years, 8 months to life.
Tapson's remarks 2 weeks ago clearly hit a nerve with District Attorney Vern Pearson, who rarely talks to the media about the Garrido case. Pearson chose to let a news release do the talking for him. Perhaps my alleged lack of compassion comes from my awareness of many disgusting facts concerning Nancy Garrido's personal involvement in this case, Pearson wrote. The DA reminded everybody that it was Nancy who actually pulled J.C. Dugard into the car in 1991 and kept her imprisoned in their backyard, even when her husband was sent back to prison for over a month in 1993. Not only was Nancy Garrido directly involved in the kidnapping of J.C. back in 1991, but she actively participated in videotaping young children before and after the 1991 abduction, Pearson wrote. So, having viewed all of the evidence and videos in this case, I will answer Mr. Tapson's question. No, I do not think that Nancy Garrido deserves my compassion. The husband of a previous Philip Garrido rape victim agreed.
Absolutely. She should stay in jail the rest of her life. Just from what she did the very first day, she should get a life sentence.
Now, there could still be a plea agreement worked out before the Garridos' next court appearance, April 7th, but don't expect it to be one that shows much compassion towards Nancy Garrido.
This was a woman who was videotaping her husband sexually abusing children that they would pull off the street into a van as they were driving around. When they took J.C. Dugard, they pulled her off the street and shot her with a stun gun. And that's how J.C. Dugard was totally immobilized and unable to do anything. And then Philip Garrido, who was already a convicted sex offender of long standing, continued to sexually abuse J.C. Dugard for decades after that. So I know you all remember this case where she was finally rescued from that backyard tent where he had had her and her 2 children by the time it was all over for such a long time. And so the point is that don't fall into the mistake of thinking that there's a stereotype of who an offender can be, because you can certainly have women sexual offenders. You absolutely can. And we tend to think otherwise. Another obstacle for prevention in youth serving organizations is a fear that even providing training in the youth serving organization might mean that there's been some incident. If you publicize that, then people might think, well, why are they doing that now? Something must have happened. So there are a lot of youth serving organizations that don't even want to have anything that has to do with child sexual abuse on their agenda just because they want to make sure their image is not tarnished in any way. But that is a mistake. It is really, in fact, proactive when you are a youth serving organization and you decide to provide training for the people who are participating. Sometimes youth serving organizations have different attitudes about sexuality, such as it's a family affair, we don't want to get involved, or that talking about sex will intrude on the cultural norms in a community. That's just another barrier that youth serving organizations have to be aware of, and they have to take into consideration and decide as an organization how upfront or not you're going to be. If you have, and I'm sure you do, have groups that come to campouts that have very strong religious beliefs that focus on being non-judgmental and forgiving, this can really fail to protect children. This is a frequent problem that we have when we have clergy sex offenders. Many times the congregations, for example, will say we shouldn't report this to the police because after all we've been taught to forgive, and how many times do you turn your cheek? 7 times 70, and they're very good at quoting the scripture on how everybody should just walk away in peace, etc. And that's been, as you know, a problem for the Catholic Church over many, many decades. If you haven't read the book Scout's Honor, I would recommend that you read it. It is a really good book, and it talks about how Patrick Boyle is an investigative journalist, and he researched a particular scoutmaster who went through numerous troops around the United States, sexually abusing multiple children in every troop. And in every case, these troops were all church-based, as many Boy Scout troops are. And in every case, the church members knew what had happened, and they just asked him to leave. And they would meet and say, as a church, you know, we're not to judge. We just want him to go away. He has hurt our children, and we just don't want him to around our children. Some of them did report to the Boy Scouts of America National Office, and some of them did not. And Patrick Boyle's point was, it was this societal looking the other way that emboldened this man as he went from troop to troop to troop, and he became a scoutmaster in numerous troops and sexually abused numerous victims. So I think that you'll find this particular book very helpful when you're about the business of trying to make determinations on how to overcome some of these obstacles. Sometimes the failure to endorse the need for training and prevention in and of itself in an organization is a barrier. There are many people who in youth serving organizations will say, we're not CPS, we're not the police, we're not any of those kinds of organizations, so why do we have to do this? They see themselves as not broken. Well, prevention is about the business of becoming educated about something so it doesn't happen to you. You will not be able to prevent something you don't know anything about. So being ignorant about a subject doesn't help you prevent it. It only helps you be ignorant about the subject, so that's not a good thing. Sometimes employees and volunteers will choose to work in a youth serving organization because they have been prior victims, and discussing child sexual abuse may be difficult for them, and so there may be some resistance in that situation. But on the other hand, fear of uncovering child sexual abuse may make leaders want to look the other way, and that's, as leaders, you don't want to, well, here's a similar thing. If you had a diabetic in your workforce and they had to give themselves injections all the time, and you wanted to make sure that everybody was safe, you might have a sharps container in your bathroom, you know, for them to be able to discard their needles. Let's just use that as an example. By not putting that sharps container there, which is a prevention mode of making sure that everybody will be okay, so it's not in the garbage, so that insulin syringes won't be in the garbage and somebody won't get stuck in housekeeping, by not doing that, you're just looking the other way. Everything will be fine, you know, no problems. That's not a good practice. It's a prevention safety step to do that kind of thing and to make it better, a user-friendly thing for your employees. Another obstacle for youth serving organizations is this issue of environmental protection. How your buildings are set up, how much tree coverage and bush coverage is out there. Could someone take a child and pull them into an isolated area in your campgrounds and easily sexually offend against them without anybody being able to see them? That's one of the reasons that daycare centers now, good daycare centers, have a two-deep policy where you always have two people in the room where children are being taken care of. And good daycare centers also have video surveillance inside the rooms just to make sure that the workers know there is video surveillance here. So you can't really abuse a child and not think somebody's going to ultimately not know about that. So recognizing the environmental issue. Sometimes there's limited or inadequate resources. Sometimes you don't have enough money, time, or personnel. And sometimes if you have poor employee retention as your camp counselors, then you have to have really frequent screening of those individuals, and you have frequent training, and that can be a problem as well. So these are some of the obstacles that you see. So if you have cabins where it's really nice and rustic and all of that is okay, but there is the risk for a camp counselor or an adult in that cabin to have access to a small number of children who might become compliant. That is one of the things to think about. I want to show you the fact that youth offenders remain and will always remain a potential threat in these kind of situations, because most of the time in youth serving organizations, you're thinking about adults who might sexually offend against children who are there. And many times we fail to think about the fact that you absolutely can have youth sex offenders who are in a camp setting. How could that happen? Well, many times if a youth sex offender has offended against several children, first of all, his own family may not know about it, or they may know about it and just said, don't do that again, which doesn't work, but that's what they'll say. And sometimes they will send a youth sex offender away to camp in order to keep him away from other children in the home, which only makes that offender potentially available to many other children rather than the children he has previously been abusing. So to rely on one strategy for child sexual abuse prevention, such as criminal background checks of employees and volunteers, will give you a false sense of security, because the majority of sex offenders have no criminal background. They have never been caught. So if you think that just doing criminal background checks only is enough, then that's not enough, because because obviously someone who's a registered sex offender or who has a positive criminal background check shouldn't get into a youth serving organization, although they sometimes do. They certainly do. We see it in foster care. We see a significant number of foster care parents who will have somebody in that home who has a positive criminal record. So the difficulty in adding this need for children's well-being to the existing policies because of discomfort, of feeling that there isn't a risk, or because there'll be disapproval of funders is another phenomenon. I have certainly talked to organizations that are nonprofit organizations who say, we don't want the word sex. In fact, it makes me think about one of my patients who right now is trying to get one of her, I won't mention the organization, but she's trying to get a high-level award from this organization, of which she's been a member since she was probably 8 years old. She's a senior in high school, and she wanted to have an online website that she put together herself about the sexualization of girls, and how this is wrong, and how for the sake of being all you can be, that's an Army term, being all you can be as a youth, female youth, you know, you should turn away from the sexualization of girls. And when she wrote it all up and she had a lot of advertisements and fashion things for her website, on her website, and when she turned it into the organization to allow for her award, the organization said, this is our organization, the word sex will not be in any website that has to do with anything that has to do with our organization. This is an all-girl youth-serving organization. The word sex, sexual, none. Is this 2012? And is this America? And is that head in the sand behavior or what? I was stunned. I thought it really stunned me, because I used to be on the board of that organization, and I thought, what? Oh my gosh. You know, and she was talking to other girls who would be coming to her website, and that's just a good example. A lack of knowledge of what help is available is also a problem, because just like we were discussing earlier today, if a child makes a disclosure and you don't know what to do about it, then that can make it a lot harder for you, right? So let's end that part of our discussion by saying that we're here because we want to help kids in this particular area.